Welcome to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. It's a limited series for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. We highlight the influential voices, partners, and leaders who are driving innovation, research, and development, creating new market opportunities and new ways of doing business in the mining industry.
PDAC 2024. And this thing's been going on for, nearly 100 years, this entire gathering, and it has grown extraordinarily. I'm talking to some of the folks who are involved, particularly on the investment side. And this is the largest mining gathering in the world. And Charlie, Angus, a lot of this happens in your backyard.
Not just happens in our backyard, which I represent Cobalt and Timmins, James Bay, Kirkland Lake, big mining country, and they're all here. I mean, everybody comes to PDAC, but the history of this incredible world class. I mean, this is the world center for mining investment. It comes literally from my backyard. It was the money from Cobalt that turned Toronto from a regional backwater into the world center for mining investment. The very first PDAC gatherings were at the old King Eddie Hotel, where all the first big northern mining deals went down in the entranceway.
A few more cigars involved, though.
A few more cigars, a lot more whiskey, and a lot more crooks. Well, okay, we'll draw back. We'll draw back on the cigar part.
Settle on the cigars, yeah. And again, I look around me here, and of course there are a lot of manufacturing firms that are bringing big machinery and so on, and I think that's probably how it started, right? They were showing that stuff off. You don't have to go very far, and we're looking at all of these companies now that are environmentally driven, and there would have been a time when we would not have drawn as close a line between the mining industry, the mining sector, in fact a lot of the natural resources, and looked at it from an environmental lens and an environmental benefit.
This is the fundamental question we're in. Our planet is on fire. The climate crisis is unfolding in real time. People are frightened. And we are either going to step up and find an alternate way of living, or we're going to condemn our children to a horrific future. And right here at PDAC, with the mining sector from all over the world here, we're at the nexus of crisis and opportunity. And I think the message that's being heard loud and clear is we have to get to sustainability. We have to get higher standards. We have to have the critical minerals in place. And it has to be done through the Indigenous lens of making sure that we are protecting Mother Earth. So when I come here now, I see not only people selling mining boots, but I see people bringing forward that level of expertise. And we have more Indigenous participation every single year. So this is where it's all happening. Literally for the planet, it happens here at PDAC. And this is why I never miss this event.
We do a lot of work with the forestry sector. And we have learned over the course of that work that, in fact, the Indigenous view, that 7 generations back, 7 generations forward. It's interesting to me to watch and see how in the 21st century now, all of this new technology and the new science around all of our natural resources has begun to adopt that old thinking, right? And they chalk it up as innovation. So I think it's really kind of interesting to see, and you don't have to go very far, to your point, to see a lot of First Nations and Indigenous communities represented here, businesses that are fully owned, where they have that ownership, but they bring that ethic to, whether it's extracting mineral or, harvesting the forests. It changes our relationship with the planet.
I've tried to explain this to people, investors, people from outside, that when Indigenous people talk about protecting Mother Earth, it's not a slogan. It is their fundamental relationship with each other and with the world. And the fascinating thing, and I've worked in many communities and I've seen many projects, and I've seen some projects go ahead and I've seen other projects not go ahead. And when they don't go ahead, it's because if you don't understand that Indigenous communities will put the safety of the earth ahead of making a dollar every single time, then you're in the wrong business in dealing with Indigenous communities. That's why their perspective is so important. And for a long time, I think this whole traditional ecological knowledge talk, companies thought it was kind of hoodoo and they would agree to it, but they didn't really take it seriously. Now they understand that sustainability lens is the lens for going forward in the 21st century. And it is the difference between companies that are going to make it and the companies who really have to be relegated back to the 20th century.
And those I've talked to over the course of this conversation, specifically mining and forestry, they will tell me that their relationship with the private sector and the First Nations, Indigenous communities is actually evolving. A lot of that's happening on Bay Street. We're seeing that. But if there is any sandpaper in that relationship, it's government more often than not that gets in its own way, as well intended as government may be with regulation or how we're creating guardrails to save the environment. Government tends to get in its own way on this stuff.
Well, I mean, the big example is when Doug Ford made the announcement that he himself was going to drive the bulldozer up to the Ring of Fire. That put that project back a decade, because it just sent a message to Indigenous communities that all their negotiating wasn't going to matter if the Premier himself said, I'm just going to drive a bulldozer through your territory. I still hear that quote given back to me from Indigenous communities. The role government has to play is to ensure that the consultation process is fair and that the rules for development are clear. But it's a matter of respect. And if we don't have respect at the fundamental level, we're not going to get projects going ahead. And where we do have respect, great things are happening. And it is something that I think we can really promote in Northern Ontario. We were the poster boys for the longest time for how to do things badly. I mean, you look at Sudbury, you look at Kirkland Lake, you look at Timmins, you look at Cobalt, the tailings, the contaminated lakes. But you look at new mining and you look at sustainability and you look at women in the industry, you look at the fact that we are moving more and more towards a critical mineral strategy that will have the EV technology really transform things. Northern Ontario is the place to teach the rest of the world, I think. We did it wrong. We're doing it right, and the rest of the world can learn from us as well. And that's why being at PDAC is so important, and seeing it's not just the big companies that are here, but all the small, literally mom and pop kind of operations.
A lot of them family owned, and they've been in generations.
Bringing forward really, really interesting, provocative ideas. That's why I basically live here during the week of PDAC, because I learn more in a week here than I can learn a year on my job in Parliament.
So what's it's easy to point to. I get the quote around Doug Ford. I understand the context and how it kind of gets people's backs up. But at the same time, we're talking about First Nations and Indigenous communities among themselves who can't agree on how best to approach Ring of Fire. And between you and me, we need it. We need that project to move forward.
Well, I think the issue is that when you've got communities like Nescandiga that went 28 years without drinking water, and no government bothered to even come up and find out what the problem was, and then turn around and say, hey, now we've got billions in your backyard we want to get. Well, that's a problem. We have to start treating these communities not like fourth worlds that we can succor, but treat them with respect. So Nescandiga has rightful issues. Ibamtung has rightful issues. They don't even have a school right now. What other community in Ontario doesn't have a school? So when we talk about what we need, I will say, and I've said this to industry many times, the greatest resource that we have isn't our chromite or our diamonds. It's that young generation of Indigenous. We invest in them, all things will happen. But if we don't invest in them, don't expect to come up and start digging in their backyard. So
if we're going to invest in them, doesn't that mean that by virtue of that, to be successful, we need First Nation and Indigenous ownership? I mean, that has to be the root of this, doesn't it?
This is the fundamental issue. It can't just be someone, we sign a quick agreement. We need to have more and more Indigenous ownership, the training, the building of expertise. And it's something that I've seen. I mean, when I started working with Indigenous communities over 24 years ago, nobody ever talked to the communities. The only time they ever talked to the communities when the community set up a blockade. Right. That was literally how the only time you ever got someone to the table. Now that's changing, and now we're starting to see more and more of that transformation. So, I think the future for what we're going to be doing is very, very bright, but we are at a critical moment, and we have to always have that environmental crisis lens that we are dealing at a moment where we can't screw these things up. So we can do it right, and we have to do it right, because if we do it wrong, it's going to have catastrophic consequences. So I feel it's a very, very exciting time to be here, and I wish it wasn't. I wish the stakes weren't as high, but the stakes are high.
But I get it. You don't want to waste a crisis. I mean, if in fact, and I don't say that to be glib, the point being, we're in a place where this now has put a point on this conversation like at no other time in terms of the climate and the crisis that we're facing, and how that is the role that our natural resource sectors play in that, whether it is contributing to it or mitigating it. I mean, the forestry people will tell you we're not paying enough attention to them in terms of the role that they can play in, actually turning back the effects of climate change.
Well, this is the issue, is that we are now having, I think, honest and tough conversations that maybe 10 and 15 years ago we beat around the bush. And a young generation is looking to us. Are you going to do this right? Can you do this right? I think there's a lot of things that we can do right. So when I
Which would be what?
That if we're going to be building an EV industry, let's get the supply chain from Canada, where we have higher standards. Then, Democratic Republic of Congo is a nightmare
But doesn't that bring us back to Ring of Fire? I mean, it would be really hard to do that without Ring of Fire.
I think there's a number of projects, and I think if Ring of Fire isn't going to meet it, there's other projects that will get off the ground. They haven't proved that they haven't built that kind of relationship with 2 of the 4 communities, so they have a problem there. Once they've done that, then we talk about where we go from here. But there are many, many projects that could get off the ground tomorrow in Northern Ontario, mining deep in Sudbury, I know outside of Timmins. So the issue is if we're going to do this supply chain, let's invest in Canada, where we actually have the environmental standards, we have the rules, we have the Indigenous agreements, as opposed to taking this out of Malaysia or, again, Congo is a nightmare of human rights abuses. So we can't say we're going to have sustainable phones and sustainable cars if we're getting them from unsustainable places. Canada's a place we can do it.
Just before you go, I want to go back to your comment around the Indigenous ownership. And again, some of the people I've talked to said there's no shortage of big thinking, technology, the expertise, the approach to this. It comes down to money. It's being able to here's the capital to get this off the ground. And by all accounts, for the most part, that's where we're falling down on this as far as our relationship with Indigenous communities are concerned. There's all kinds of people waving their hands saying it's a great idea and I can get an ROI on it, but somebody else is making the money. If we want those communities to do it, where do we, without government ownership, where do we get to a point where we incentivize that in terms of making sure that the capital's available for this newer generation of Indigenous Canadians to be able to come in and say, I'm going to run this business myself in Northern Ontario?
Well, it is a big question for government right now and industry as well, because we actually are starting to see some major lawsuits over lack of consultation. I would much rather have that money being put on the table to create opportunity than having the government pay compensation for refusing to do their job. Mm-hmm. And we've seen billions put on the table in terms of moratoriums that are being called because of lack of consultation. The clean water issues, where there are now lawsuits. We went through how many billions of dollars in the child welfare case because they were pulling Indigenous kids out of their homes without giving proper support. Canada can pay compensation after the fact, or Canada can invest in the communities and let the communities develop. And once the communities develop, then we're in a whole different realm of justice and dignity and sustainability. And I think that's the lesson. We've got to stop banging our heads against the wall of running the old Indian Act and say, there's a much better future. So let's get to it and let's sit down and talk about how those doors open.
Is there a region in Canada that's doing it better than somewhere else? Is there a point? I know the example out of Meadow Lake, for example, in Saskatchewan. Really great opportunity there for 9 nations to come together. Now they are an incredible footprint in the forestry sector in that province. They've got 600 jobs and all those sorts of things that it's too easy here on Front Street in Toronto to kind of ignore or sort of take for granted, but it has its incredible effect on 2 things: the economy of the province. The second thing is this whole level of First Nations and Indigenous ownership. They don't want to bang their own drum and be all excited about it, but I look at them and think, man, that's a great model, and why aren't we doing it elsewhere?
I think British Columbia is really interesting. British Columbia is also where the biggest court battles went down, because the government never signed the proper treaties in British Columbia. So we went through the 80s and the 90s with blockades and lawsuits and legal decisions. And now we're starting to actually see self-government. We're starting to see treaties on the ground, and we're starting to see development in a really interesting way. Northern Quebec, the other great example with the James Bay Cree. They came together as one, as a unit, not individual communities, but came together as the Grand Council of the Cree and set the terms for development. And when you go up to northern Quebec, the difference between the communities on the northern Quebec side of James Bay and the Ontario side is night and day. That comes from sitting down and negotiating as a nation and saying, this is what we need and this is what we're going to do for development. So the lessons are there. And I think Treaty 9, Anishinaabe Nation, these are partners we should be having at the table. We shouldn't be having to go to court and fight over ignoring basic obligations in terms of the relationship. But there's huge opportunity. So I'm an optimist. I know sometimes
you gotta be.
I sometimes you got to put the brass knuckles on to get justice, but other times I see things are happening, things are changing. They're just not changing fast enough, and I think that's what people recognize.
Yeah, well, as I said, we're into a crisis. Let's not waste it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good of you to join us. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on this show.
Thanks for listening to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. The series is produced for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. For more information, visit our website, northbayecho.ca.